Clara Devereux was made to sit below the salt at her own husband's table. Her place card read only Mrs. Devereux. The words "Her Grace" had been there once. You could still see them, scratched out in another hand, the ink pressed deep and angry into the good cream paper. She did not flush. She did not weep. She read the card twice, slowly, the way she read everything. Then she turned it face down on the cloth and folded her hands. Before 30 dinner guests, the Duke's aunt lifted her glass. The candlelight caught the wine and held it like a jewel. "We are always grateful to the tradesman's money, my dear," she said, and she smiled while she said it. "Do sit where trade is comfortable." She spoke the word trade the way you might speak of a stain on a tablecloth, something to be got out, something that should never have been there. That night, when the house was dark, Clara slipped a single broker's letter into her glove. She did not open it. She did not sleep. She lay in the cold and she listened to the old house settle around her, and she held the letter against her wrist like a second pulse. If you believe love is built with two pairs of hands, this story is for you. Before we go on, if this story finds you tonight, take a moment to subscribe and tell me in the comments the town you're watching from. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. Now, let me take you back to how she came to sit below the salt and what she carried in her glove, because the woman they thought they had bought was about to teach an entire county to count. It was autumn in Wexbridge, in the county of Somerset, in the year 1876. The leaves had turned along the Hartwell Road, gold and rust and a deep wet brown, and the mornings came in slow with mist off the low fields. Hartwell Court stood where it had stood for 200 years. Grey stone, tall windows, a great house that had begun to feel, in those days, like a beautiful coat worn thin at the elbows. Clara had come to it in June. She had come by way of a solicitor's office in a narrow street, where two men in black had slid papers across a table and asked her to sign. Her father had been dead 6 months by then. Josiah Ainsworth, a Liverpool man, cotton and shipping, a man who had built his fortune from nothing but nerve and arithmetic and long hours in a counting house that smelled of tar and ledger ink. He had left it all to her. His only child. His girl, he used to say, who could add a column faster than any clerk he ever hired. She had signed the papers. Her fortune for a failing dukedom. Hartwell Court was mortgaged to the eaves, and the man she married needed her money the way a drowning man needs a rope. Everyone knew it. No one said it. That was how these things were done. But you should know what Clara was before you hear what they made of her. Because they never troubled to find out. In her first week at Hartwell, she found the farm accounts. Nobody gave them to her. She simply asked the way to the estate office and let herself in, and she sat at the steward's desk in the low autumn light, and she began to read. She read the way other women read a novel. A rent roll, a grain return, a column of figures for timber sold off the North Wood. She could hold a whole page in her head and turn it like a thing she could touch. Her father had taught her that. "Numbers don't lie to you, girl," he used to say. "People lie. Numbers only ever tell you what people have done." She learned the tenants' names. All of them. Old Marbury at the mill, who was slow with his Michaelmas rent because his wife had been sick. The Pools at 10 Acre, 4 children, a leaking roof the agent kept promising to mend. She learned which cottages took the worst of the wind and which fields flooded when the river came up. She kept it all in her head, and she never once made a note in front of anyone, because she had learned young that a woman who is seen to be clever is a woman who is watched. There is a small thing she did that first month that tells you everything. Mrs. Pettifer, the housekeeper, kept the household books, and Mrs. Pettifer was proud, and Mrs. Pettifer's arithmetic had begun to fail her with her eyes. One evening Clara found her near tears over a total that would not come right. 2 shillings out. A small thing, but Mrs. Pettifer had gone over it 4 times, and the more she went over it, the worse it got, and she was frightened. Because a housekeeper who cannot keep her books is a housekeeper who can be turned off. Clara did not take the book from her. She stood beside her at the still room table, and she said, in a low voice, as if she were only thinking aloud, "I always find the candles are where I go wrong. Shall we do the candles again together?" And they did the candles again together, and Clara let Mrs. Pettifer find the error herself, guiding her to it so gently that the old woman believed she had found it alone. 2 shillings. Restored, no one shamed. When it was done, Mrs. Pettifer looked at her for a long moment, and something in the housekeeper's hard face went soft, and she said, "Thank you, Your Grace." And she meant it. She was, for a long while, the only one in that house who did. Because Lady Augusta Devereux ruled the corridors of Hartwell, and Lady Augusta had decided what Clara was before Clara ever crossed the threshold. She was the Duke's aunt, his late father's sister, 58 years old, straight as a poker, with a face that had been handsome once and was now only sharp. She had run the household through her brother's life and through the boy Julian's growing up, and she kept the bloodline the way other women keep silver, polished and locked and counted. She had a voice like cool water and a way of correcting you that left no mark you could show anyone. She corrected Clara's fish fork at the second dinner, reached across without a word and touched the right one, and let her hand rest there just long enough for the footman to see. She had Clara seated by the door, where the draught came through, and called it the warmest chair, my dear, you feel the cold, coming from the north as you do. She forgot, again and again, to have Clara announced as her Grace. It was always Mrs. Devereux from Augusta's lips, or my nephew's wife, or simply she. 1,000 small cuts, each one too small to bleed, all of them together a slow letting of blood. Julian saw some of it, and not enough. That was the shape of him. Julian Devereux, 30th of his name to hold Hartwell, or near it, a tall reserved man who had inherited his father's title and his father's debts in the same black-edged week. He was not cruel, you must understand that. He was decent, in the way that decent men are sometimes useless, and he was ashamed of the mortgage, ashamed that he had married for money, ashamed, most of all, that he needed the money of a Liverpool cotton merchant to keep the roof over the heads of 200 years of Devereux, and a man that ashamed does not look too hard at the woman who is the source of his shame. He was polite to Clara, he was distant, he mistook his aunt's approval for the shape of the world, and he was slow, God he was slow, to see what was in front of him. He began to see it over a ledger. It happened in October. Clara had been going through the timber accounts, the sales off the estate's own woods, and something in them had begun to itch at her. Not a figure that was wrong, a figure that was too smooth. The Northwood had sold a great deal of good oak over 3 years, and the price it fetched, on paper, was always a little under what oak fetched anywhere else in the county, and the difference was always small, and the difference was always there. She knew that pattern. Her father had shown it to her when she was 14. A man who steals a lot at once gets caught. Girl, a man who steals a little every time, forever, dies rich in his bed. Watch for the little, steady wrongness. That's the dangerous kind. The steward's name was Fenwick. He had been at Hartwell 12 years. He was liked. He had a good coat and a good horse, and he tipped his hat to the ladies. And Clara said nothing about him to anyone, because she had learned that if you accuse the man defends himself, and if you show the numbers cannot. She went to Julian in the estate office. She did not say Fenwick is robbing you. She laid 3 years of timber sales on the desk, side by side, and beside them she laid the county timber prices she had copied out of the market reports at the lending library in Wexbridge, and she said, "I wonder if you would look at these 2 columns with me. I may be reading them wrong. I often do." She did not read them wrong. She never once read them wrong. but she gave him the room to be the one to see it, and she watched his face while he did. He was quiet for a long time. His finger moved down the columns. Once, twice, she saw the moment it landed, the small tightening around his eyes. He looked up at her, and for the first time since June he looked at her as though she were a person and not a debt, and he said, "How long have you known?" "A week," she said. "I wanted to be sure." £900, he said, low doing the sum she had already done. Every year. £900 a year for 3 years. He sat back. Something moved across his face that she could not quite read, and it was a long moment before she understood it was respect. "I have known that man since I was a boy," he said. "I know," said Clara. "That is why he could do it. We only steal from the people who trust us." She had not meant to say we. It was her father in her mouth. But Julian did not seem to notice. He was looking at the columns again, and then he was looking at her, and there was a question in it now that had not been there before. That was the first degree, the first thing that turned in him. Fenwick was gone within the fortnight, quietly, with no scandal, because Clara had counselled quiet. £900 a year came back to the estate, and Julian Devereux began, without quite knowing he was doing it, to watch his wife. There was a glass house at the back of Hartwell, past the walled garden, that had been his mother's. The late Duchess had loved it. She had grown oranges in it, and lemons, and things that had no business growing in Somerset, and when she died the fires had gone out under it, and no one had lit them again. The panes had gone green, the vines had gone to wood. It stood there at the edge of the grounds like a held breath, full of dead things and cold glass, and everyone at Hartwell walked past it, and no one went in. Clara went in. She went in on a grey afternoon in November, and she stood in the cold ruin of it, and she saw at once what it had been and what it could be again. It was an engineering problem, mostly, and Clara liked engineering problems. The flues were sound, they had only wanted cleaning. The great vine was not dead, only sleeping. She scraped a nail along a stem and found green under the bark. She had the gardeners light the fires again. She had the panes washed, one by one, 400 panes, until the grey light came through clean. She pruned the dead wood back herself, in an old pair of gloves, until her hands ached, and she did not tell anyone why she was doing it, because she did not entirely know. Perhaps because it was a thing that had been loved and left, and she knew something about that. And while she was about the orangery, she settled a thing the agent had botched. The pools at 10 Acre and 2 families beside them had a grievance over water, a ditch, a boundary, a right to draw from the stream that had been theirs by custom for longer than anyone living could remember, and the new agent had drawn the line wrongly on a map and set the 3 families against the estate and against each other. It had been festering for a year. Rent was being withheld. Words had been said that could not be unsaid. The agent had made it a matter of law. Clara made it a matter of arithmetic and pride. She walked out to 10 Acre herself, in the mud, in a plain coat, and she sat in Mrs. Poole's kitchen, and drank the tea and let the woman talk. Then she walked the ditch. She found where the old line truly ran, from a boundary stone half sunk in the bank that the agent's map had missed, and she found it because she had thought to ask the oldest man in the parish where his father had told him it ran. She put the line back where custom had always had it. She let the 3 families keep their water. It cost the estate almost nothing. It bought the estate something the agent's law had nearly thrown away, which was the goodwill of 200 people who worked its land. The house felt it. You cannot say exactly how a house comes to warm to a person, but it happens, in the way the footmen stand, in whether the maids meet your eye, in the small 1,000 courtesies that cannot be commanded and can only be given. Hartwell began to give them to Clara. And Julian, coming out one cold morning to find the orangery lit from within, its glass gold in the early sun. The first pale blossom breaking on his dead mother's vine stood at the door and looked at his wife among the green things, her sleeves pushed up, dirt on her hands, and he smiled. He did not mean to. It came up out of him before he could stop it, unguarded, boyish, gone almost before it arrived. But she saw it. That was the second degree. Now I must tell you about a thing that was said in the library at Hartwell one wet afternoon, because it was said carelessly, and it was heard carelessly, and it was the most important thing anyone said in that house all autumn, and not one of them knew it. The family solicitor had come down from London on some business of the estate. He was a dry, precise man, Mr. Grimshaw, and he sat with Julian and with Lady Augusta going over the year's papers, and the marriage settlement came up, as such things do. Grimshaw read from it in his flat lawyer's voice. He read the dowry figure, the great sum Josiah Ainsworth's fortune had settled on the dukedom, and Augusta's face at that figure was the face of a woman tasting something sweet. And then Grimshaw read on, because a good lawyer reads to the end, and he said, and the settlement provides, of course, that the Ainsworth line shares remain in her Grace's own name, held separately, at her sole disposal, being her personal property, and not comprehended within the marriage portion. He said it, and he moved on. It was a technicality. It was the kind of clause that fills the middle of every settlement ever drawn, and Augusta waved her hand at it the way you wave at a fly. Yes, yes, she said. Some ships, I suppose. Sentiment. The girl may keep her ribbons. She had heard the great figure, the dowry, and she had heard nothing after it. She had read the number she was being paid, and she had not read one word past it. No one at Hartwell troubled to read past the number they were being paid. Remember that. Remember the Ainsworth line shares, held separately, at Clara's sole disposal, her own, liquid, and hers. Augusta had just been told, in plain words, in her own library, exactly how she would fall. And she had waved it away as ribbons. Julian did not mark it either. He was thinking of the mortgage. He was always, in those months, thinking of the mortgage, the great note that hung over the house, and he did not hear his wife's quiet wealth named aloud any more than his aunt did. Only Clara, who was not in the room, would have marked it, because Clara had drawn breath in a counting house, and she knew that the whole world turns on the clauses other people skip. And so we come to the harvest dinner. It was the great county dinner of the year, the one Augusta lived for, 30 guests, the best families for 20 miles, the long table in the great hall laid with the silver that had not yet been sold, candles the length of it, hothouse fruit, the good wine from the last of the cellar. It was Augusta's stage. She had planned it for weeks, and she had planned, in it, to put the merchant's daughter in her place before the whole county, once and finally, so that there could be no doubt in any drawing-room in Somerset about what Clara Devereux was. The salt cellar sat in the middle of the table, a great old silver thing, the Hartwell salt that had marked the divide at that table for 150 years. Above the salt sat the family and the honoured. Below the salt sat the lesser folk, the poor cousins, the tutor, the people who were asked out of duty and seated out of truth. Augusta had Clara seated below the salt, at her own husband's table, below the salt, and she had done the thing with the place card. She had taken Clara's card, where the words Her Grace the Duchess of Hartwell had been written fair by the secretary, and she had struck those words out with her own pen, hard, so the paper nearly tore, and had left standing only Mrs. Devereux, a merchant's wife, a tradesman's daughter, not a duchess at all. Clara came in on Julian's arm, and the county rose, and she was beautiful that night, calm and dark-eyed and still, and Augusta watched her walk the length of the table to the low end and find her card. Everyone watched. That was the point of it. Everyone watched her read it. And Clara read it twice. Slowly she saw the struck-out words. She saw whose anger had struck them out. And she did the one thing Augusta had not planned for, the thing there was no answer to. She did not flush, and she did not weep, and she did not make a scene the county could tut over for a month. She turned the card face down on the cloth, and she sat, below the salt, straight-backed, and she folded her hands, and she waited. The dinner went on. The talk was bright and false. And when the second course was set, and the wine was poured, Lady Augusta rose a little in her seat and lifted her glass, and the table quieted for her the way tables always did, and she looked down the long shining length of it to where Clara sat below the salt, and she smiled her cool smile, and she said, so that all 30 of them heard it clear, we are always grateful to the tradesman's money. My dear, do sit where trade is comfortable. And she drank. There was a silence then of a particular kind, the kind where 30 well-bred people all decide at once to look at their plates. Somewhere a fork touched china. Lady Sybil Croft, the well-born, well-dowered girl Augusta had always favoured, the girl she had wanted for Julian, gave a small laugh through her nose and covered it with her napkin, and did not cover it quite fast enough. And Julian Devereux, Duke of Hartwell, sat at the head of his own table between his aunt and his blood and his shame, and he opened his mouth, and the moment for a man to defend his wife is very short, it is 2 seconds wide, and it closed while he was still finding the words. By the time anything might have come out of him, it was too late. The wine was drunk. The insult had landed. The table had moved on with relief into loud talk of the hunting. He said nothing fast enough. He would remember that. For the rest of his life he would remember that he said nothing fast enough. Clara did not look at him. She looked at her plate, and then she looked, for one long moment, down the table at the old silver salt cellar that divided her from her husband, and something behind her still face was doing arithmetic. Not the arithmetic of revenge. She was not a woman for tears, and she was not a woman for scenes, and she was, it turned out, not a woman for revenge either. Not the hot kind. She was doing the other arithmetic. The cold, patient, counting-house kind, the kind her father had done. Who holds the paper? Where does the money truly sit? What is the shape of the thing under the thing? She got through the dinner. She was gracious to the tutor beside her, who was mortified on her behalf and did not know where to look, and she put him at his ease, because that was who she was. She could not help but mend the smaller person's dignity even while her own was being torn down the middle of a table. And when it was over she went up to her cold room, and she did not sleep. Julian came to her that night. He found her not in her room but in the orangery, which she had gone to in her nightgown and a shawl, because it was the one warm place in that whole cold house, and because the blossom was there, breaking pale in the dark under the glass. She was standing among his mother's oranges in the middle of the night, quite still. He stood in the doorway. He was not a man of ready words, and he had none ready now. "Clara," he said, "what my aunt said." It should not have been said. I am sorry for it. She did not turn round at once. When she did, her face was not angry. That was almost worse. It was thoughtful. "You are sorry for it," she said. "Yes, I believe you are." She let that sit. Then she asked him a question, and it was such a strange question, so far from anything he expected, that he could only stare at her. "Julian," she said, "whose name is on the mortgage of this house?" He blinked. The bank's," he said. "The estate has a note. You know this. £62,000 against the land falling due at—" He stopped. He frowned. "Why do you ask me that? Now of all times?" "Which bank?" said Clara. And Julian Devereux, Duke of Hartwell, master of 200 years of that house, did not know. He did not know the name of the bank that could take his home from him. He knew the figure, 62,000, it lived in him like a stone, but the name of the hand that held the stone he had never troubled to learn. It was money. Money was beneath a gentleman's notice, except in the having of it. "I don't," "Grimshaw handles it," he said. "It is some Wexbridge house, I believe." "Does it matter what it is called?" "It matters," said Clara, "more than anything at this table tonight," and she said it so quietly and with such certainty that he had no answer at all. She did not tell him more. She had learned, hadn't she, over long months in that house, that she was watched, that her cleverness frightened them, that a woman who is seen to be planning is a woman who is stopped. She had learned it the hard way, and she had learned it well. So she said good night to her husband among the oranges, and she watched him go, still baffled, still ashamed, still slow, and then she sat down on the cold iron bench under the vine, and she began, in her head, to build. In the days after the dinner, Clara did a thing that no one thought to prevent, because no one thought her capable of it. She read the estate papers. All of them. Not the polite summary Grimshaw provided, but the papers themselves, the deeds and the note and the schedules, down to the last line of the smallest clause, the way her father had taught her, because the truth of any deal is always in the last line that everyone else skipped. And there she found the shape of it, the whole shape. And when she found it, she sat very still for a long time, because it was more than she had hoped. The £62,000 note on Hartwell Court was held by the Merchants and County Bank of Wexbridge, a local house. And when Clara read what she could find of the Merchants and County Bank of Wexbridge, in the market reports, in the little printed notices, in the things a merchant's daughter knew how to read, she saw a thing that made her draw one slow breath. The bank was weak. It had lent too freely and too long against too little. It was thinly capitalized, which is to say, it did not have, behind its grand name, very much true money at all. Its shares had begun to slip, and it was propped up, held together, kept from tipping over, by the loyalty and the deposits and the borrowings of a handful of county families who all banked there because their fathers had banked there and had never troubled to look past the name over the door. 3 of the great houses of that county owed their mortgages to the Merchants and County, and Lady Augusta Devereux, who despised trade, who spoke the word like a stain, drew her own private annuity, the money she lived on, the money that made her independent and sharp and safe, from an investment in that same small, weak, overlent bank. The bank that could take Hartwell. The bank the county leaned on. The bank Augusta's whole comfort rested upon. One bank, weak, slipping, and for sale if a person had the wit to see it and the means to move, in the open market, share by quiet share. And Clara had the means. Here is where you must remember the library, and the clause Augusta waved away as ribbons. The Ainsworth Line shares, her father's shipping company, held in her own name separately, at her sole disposal, not swallowed into the dowry, not tangled in the marriage, hers, and unlike land, unlike a great grey house, unlike a title, shipping shares are liquid. They can be sold in a morning. They can be turned into money, real money, a great deal of it, faster than any Hartwell had ever turned anything into anything. Clara's true fortune had never gone into the marriage at all. It sat waiting, in her own name, in the city, while a whole county called her a pauper who had been generous enough to buy herself a duke. She sat in the estate office with the papers around her, and she understood, fully for the first time, the exact size of the mistake they had made. They had read the number they were being paid. They had not read one word past it. They had bought her dowry and insulted her person, and never once asked what else the merchant's daughter might be holding in her own 2 hands. She did not weep that night either. She was, I told you, not a woman for tears. She went instead to the little writing desk in her room, and she trimmed a pen, and she took out a clean sheet, and by the light of one candle she wrote a letter. She wrote to Mr. Halloway. Halloway had been her father's broker in the city for 30 years, a small, exact, faithful man who had loved Josiah Ainsworth and who had wept, actually wept, at the reading of the will, and who had said to Clara, quietly, on that day, anything, Miss Ainsworth. Anything at all, at any hour. Your father made me. I am yours. She had thanked him and thought no more of it. She thought a great deal of it now. She wrote to Halloway, and her hand was steady and her figures were clear, and what she told him to do was this: to begin buying, quietly, patiently, without her name attached to any of it, the shares of the Merchants and County Bank of Wexbridge. Not in a rush, not in a way that would move the price or wake the sleepers, through 3 different brokers, in 3 different parcels, under names that were not hers, the way a careful man builds a position no one sees until it is finished. To buy, and to keep buying, through the autumn and into the winter, and on towards spring, until she told him to stop. She wrote out the sums. She wrote out the method. She had planned it, she found, almost without knowing she was planning it, since the moment she had turned that place card face down on the cloth. And when it was written, she did not seal it with the ducal crest. There was a great silver seal for that, the Hartwell arms, that stood on the hall table for the family's letters. She did not use it. She reached instead into the small box she had brought from Liverpool, and she took out her father's seal. A plain thing, steel, not silver, worn smooth by his thumb over 40 years. The seal of a counting house that had closed 10,000 honest bargains and never once pretended to be grand. She melted the wax, and she pressed her father's steel into it, and she sealed the letter that would buy the bank with the mark of the trade they had spat upon. Then she sat in the dark with the sealed letter in front of her, and outside the window the first frost was coming down over the Somerset fields, silvering the dead orangery glass, creeping over the great grey shoulders of Hartwell Court, where her husband slept not knowing, where his aunt slept triumphant, where 30 guests had gone home to 30 drawing-rooms to say what a pity it was, the Duke marrying trade, and how well Lady Augusta had put the creature in her place. None of them knew. That was the sweetness of it, and Clara felt it, cold and clean, sitting there in the frostlight with her father's seal cooling in the wax. Not one of them knew that the merchant's daughter had just, with 1 letter and 1 steel seal, set her hand upon the single thread that held their whole grand world together, and had begun, very gently, so gently no one would feel it for months, to pull. She would not tell Julian. That was the thing she decided in the cold that night, and it was the right decision, and it was the seed of everything that would nearly break her, though she could not have known that yet. She would not beg to be loved. She would not explain herself to earn a place at the table. She had been made to sit below the salt, and she would say nothing, and she would do everything, and when spring came, when the note fell due. When Augusta lifted her glass again, expecting to watch the merchant's brat bankrupted and thrown down at last, Clara would already own the bank. She put the letter for the Morning Post. She blew out the candle. And in the dark of Hartwell Court, while a whole county slept certain of exactly who she was, Clara Devereux lay awake, with a broker's promise gathering in the city like a tide, and she smiled, once, at the ceiling, and she waited for the frost to give way to spring. The spring did not come all at once. It never does in Somerset. It comes in a grudging way, 1 warm morning and then a week of rain, and the frost giving up the ground an inch at a time. Clara watched it from the estate office window through the long back half of the winter, and while the county waited for the thaw, the tide she had set moving in the city gathered, quiet and cold and certain, exactly where no one thought to look. The letters came from Halloway once a fortnight. They came plain, in an ordinary hand addressed to a Mrs. Ainsworth at a receiving house in Wexbridge, so that nothing crossed the Hartwell threshold with her name and her business on the same page. She would walk down for them herself. 2 miles in the cold and 2 miles back, and she never once complained of it, because those letters were the only warm thing in that house that belonged to her alone. The parcels were small at first, 100 shares here, 200 there. Bought through a wool factor in Bristol, a solicitor's clerk in Bath, a shipping agent who had once owed her father a favour and remembered it. No single purchase large enough to move the price, no single name that meant anything. The Merchants and County Bank of Wexbridge did not feel her hand at its throat. It felt nothing at all. It went on lending against land it would never see, and paying its little dividends, and thinking itself grand. And all the while Clara sat at the Hartwell table below the salt and said nothing, and did everything. They thought she was playing. That was the beautiful part. Augusta had decided, somewhere in the first frost, that the merchant's brat had been humbled at last, and that her endless sitting in the estate office with the ledgers open was the harmless twitching of a shopkeeper's child who could not help herself. "She likes her little sums," Augusta said once. At breakfast, loud enough. "Let her have them. It keeps her from underfoot." Clara buttered her bread. She took no sugar in her tea. She said, "Yes, aunt," and she did not look up, and inside her the tide came in another foot. But the winter was not all cold. That is the thing about Clara's story that people forget when they tell it. It was not only revenge gathering in the dark. Something else was gathering too, slower even than the shares, and Julian was the one it gathered in. It started with the sugar. She had never told him she took none. But one grey morning at breakfast the footman reached to sweeten her cup as he always did, from habit, and Julian said, without looking up from his letter, "She doesn't take it." 4 words. The footman stopped. Clara looked at her husband across the toast rack. He had already gone back to his letter, colour just touching his neck, as though he had said too much. He had noticed. In all the noise of that house, in all the cold, he had noticed the smallest true thing about her, and he had spoken it aloud in front of a servant, and that was a kind of defending, small as a seed. She said nothing. But she remembered it. There was the night she fell asleep over the timber accounts. 2 in the morning, the candle guttering, her cheek down on the county price reports she had copied by hand from the lending library at Wexbridge. She woke near dawn with a horse blanket over her shoulders that had not been there when she closed her eyes, and the fire built up fresh, and she knew no servant would have dared come into the estate office at that hour uninvited. Only one man in that house had the right. She sat a long while in the grey light with the blanket about her, and she did not cry, because she had promised herself she would not, but it was a near thing. And there was the orangery. Through the whole dead winter she went to it. 400 panes, half of them cracked, the great old vine sleeping along the back wall like something waiting to be forgiven. She had the glaziers in from Wexbridge. Quietly, paid from the household budget, she now ran to the shilling. She had the flues cleared and a small stove lit. And under her hands, in the worst of the cold, the vine woke. It put out 1 bud, then a dozen, then a green rush of them all along the old wood. And the smell began, that faint, clean orange flower smell that no one at Hartwell had breathed in 20 years, not since the late Duchess died and the glass went dark. Julian found her there one afternoon in February. He stood in the doorway a long time before she knew he was there. When she turned, he was looking not at her, but at the vine, at the buds, and his face had come open in a way she had never seen it, all the ducal stiffness gone out of it, and he looked young and stricken and glad. "My mother planted that," he said. "I thought it was dead." "Everyone said it was dead. It only wanted feeding," Clara said. "And a little warmth. Most things do." He looked at her then, properly, across the green light, and the smell of the blossom, and he said her name, not Your Grace, which was cold, and not Duchess, which was the county's word for her. He said Clara, just that, and it landed in the warm air between them like a coin set down on a counter. Paid meant it was the 3rd degree of a thing she had not let herself count. And she felt it go through her, and she turned back to the vine so he would not see her face. That was the winter. Her hand tightening on the bank an inch at a time in the city, his hand opening toward her an inch at a time at home, and neither knowing the true size of what the other was doing. If it had gone on like that, gently, they might have come to each other slow and safe, but it did not go on like that. because Augusta was watching too, and Augusta was not a fool, only proud, and one grey morning in early March, a letter came to the house that should have gone to the receiving house in Wexbridge, and Augusta was in the hall when the post was brought. She took it up. She saw the city postmark and the careful clerk's hand and the name Ainsworth, and something in her went still and cold and delighted. She did not open it. She was too clever for that, and besides, she did not need to. She had read enough. She had a broker's letter, addressed to a merchant's name, coming secretly to her nephew's wife. And Augusta, who had never once in her life imagined that trade might outfinance nobility, imagined instead the only thing her mind could hold, that the creature was up to something low. Dealing, trafficking, buying and selling in the gutter of the city like her father before her, and dragging the Devereux name down into the muck with her. She went to Julian with it that same afternoon. Clara was not there. Clara was at the orangery of all places, with her hands in the good black earth, knowing nothing. "I have tried to spare you this," Augusta said. She had the letter in her hand. She held it as though it soiled her glove. "But I am your father's sister, Julian, and I will not watch you made a fool of under your own roof. Your wife is meddling in trade behind your name. Look, a broker. Letters in secret to a merchant's name. She is buying and selling in the city like a costermonger, Julian, disgracing you, disgracing the house, and she has not troubled to tell you one word of it. And Julian, decent, slow, proud Julian, who had spent 30 years being taught that his family's approval was the same thing as love, Julian believed her. Not because he wished to, because it was March, and his nerves were worn to the bone by the great note falling due at Lady Day. £62,000 he could not pay, hanging over the only thing he had left in the world. And here was his aunt telling him his wife was gambling the name away in the dark. He was frightened, and a frightened man reaches for the story that is put in his hand. He found Clara in the orangery at dusk. The stove was warm, and the blossom was open now, white and heavy, the smell of it thick as a room. She looked up from the earth with soil on her hands, and something glad still in her face from the work, and she saw his face, and the gladness went out of hers. "What is this?" he said. He held out the letter. He did not shout. It would have been better if he had shouted. His voice was flat and hurt, and it was the voice of a man repeating what he had been told. "You are dealing in the city, buying and selling, trafficking in shares behind my name like—" He stopped. He could not quite say it. But she heard the word he did not say, and she knew whose mouth had put it in his. She stood up slowly. She wiped her hands on her apron, the plain shop apron she still wore for the work, and she did not look at the letter. "Whose hand gave you that?" she said. "That is not the question. It is the only question." Her voice was very quiet. "Whose hand?" He did not answer, and his silence answered. And here was the moment. Here was the thing she had promised herself in the frost, the promise that was right and was also the seed of everything that nearly broke her. She could have told him. 6 words would have done it. "I am buying the bank that owns you." She had the whole of it ready, the mortgage, the shares, the tide, come nearly to the full. She could have laid it out on the potting bench in 1 clean minute and watched his fear turn to wonder. And she did not. Because he had believed his aunt over her without asking. Because he had come to her with an accusation in his hand instead of a question. Because she had sworn, sitting in the cold with her father's seal cooling in the wax, that she would not explain herself to earn a place at the table, that she would not beg to be loved. So she looked at her husband across the white blossom his dead mother had planted, and she said the coldest true thing she had ever said. "I have saved you £900 a year on your timber. I have mended your accounts and settled your tenants and brought this glass back from the dead. I have asked you for nothing, and the first time your aunt puts a story in your hand, you carry it to me like a summons." She untied the apron. She folded it, once and laid it on the bench. When you would rather I were poor and quiet than useful, Julian, you have only to say so, and I will oblige you. I will go and sit in the dower wing and take up embroidery, and you may keep your honour. And I will keep my hands to myself. Clara, Her Grace, she said, if you please, you have not earned my name today. And she walked past him out of the warm and the blossom into the cold March dusk. And she did not weep where he could see her, and she went to the dower wing at the far cold end of Hartwell Court, and she shut the door. She wept there, once alone, with her father's steel seal in her hand and the blossom smell still on her fingers. She put her face down and wept. Because she had wanted him, God help her, she had wanted the man and not only the victory, and she had just chosen the victory. It was the right choice, and it was the wrong choice, and it was hers. Then she washed her face in cold water, and she sat down at the little desk, and she wrote to Halloway, and she did not tremble, and she told him to close it, to bring in the last parcel, to finish. Because Lady Day was 3 weeks off, and the tide was nearly full, and pride or no pride, broken heart or no broken heart, the merchant's daughter was going to own the bank. The last 3 weeks of that winter were the strangest of Clara's life. She and Julian did not speak. They passed in the corridors like two ghosts who had once been warm. He came to the dower wing door twice. The first time she did not open it. The second time he stood a long while, and then she heard him say, low through the wood, "The sugar." I remembered about the sugar. And then nothing. And then his steps going away. She sat on the other side of the door with her hand flat against it, and she said nothing, because saying nothing was the only country she had left to hold. Augusta, meanwhile, was in glory. She had won. She was sure of it. The wife banished to the dower wing, the nephew wretched, the note falling due, and no possible way on earth for the estate to meet it. She had already begun, quietly, to talk of after. She had Lady Sybil Croft to dine twice that fortnight, dull, cold, well-bred Sybil, whom she had wanted for Julian from the first. When this unpleasantness resolves itself, Augusta told Sybil's mother over the teacups, loud enough for the footman, and it will resolve itself at Lady Day, I think, one way or another. The county will understand that some mistakes are best undone. Blood tells. It always tells. And Sybil smiled her cold, approved smile, and thought herself a duchess already. None of them had read past the number they were being paid. That was the whole of it, in the end. 12 years Fenwick had stolen timber, and no one read the column. £62,000 the family owed, and no one troubled to learn the name of the bank that held it. And the marriage settlement had left the Ainsworth line shares in Her Grace's own name, liquid, separate, untouched, and Augusta had waved that clause away with the back of her hand because she had read the dowry total and stopped her eyes there. Satisfied, they lived in a house they had never once counted, and Clara had counted everything. The letter came on the 20th of March. Halloway's hand, and under the plain clerk's cover a second sheet, folded small, that she opened alone at the little desk, with her heart going hard. It said what she had waited all winter to read. The controlling block was secured. Held in her name now, drawn together out of all the little nominee parcels into one hand, hers, unbreakable, and more. With the largest holding came, by the bank's own rules, the right to a seat at its board, and the board, learning at last who its greatest shareholder was, had done the only thing frightened men of business could do. They had offered the directorship, with every courtesy, to Her Grace the Duchess of Hartwell. The bank that held the mortgage on Hartwell Court was hers. The £62,000 note that fell due at Lady Day was hers to call or to forgive as she pleased. Augusta's own annuity, drawn on that same thin bank, sat now in the palm of the woman she had seated below the salt. Clara read it twice, exactly as she had read the place card. She set it down. She did not smile at the ceiling this time. She sat very still in the cold, clean light, and she felt the whole vast weight of it settle into her hands, and then she did the thing she had planned since the frost. She took out a fresh card and a good pen, and in her own clear counting-house hand she wrote 3 words. Her Grace, Clara Devereux, and under it, small, Hartwell, her place card for the spring dinner, written by no one's hand but her own. The spring dinner at Hartwell was Julian's doing, not Augusta's, and that surprised the county. He had sent the cards a fortnight before, 30 guests, the same 30 who had watched his wife struck down in the autumn, Sybil and her mother among them, the chairman of the Merchants and County Bank of Wexbridge among them too, for he was a county man and dined where dukes dined. Augusta thought she understood it. She thought Julian meant to show the county the estate still stood, to hold his head up on the eve of ruin, perhaps even to let them see the future Duchess in waiting seated near him. She dressed for it as for a coronation. What Julian actually knew, that night, no one in that hall knew he knew, because the morning of the dinner a letter had come for the Duke of Hartwell in a city hand, and it was from Halloway. And Halloway, loyal to Clara, but loyal also to the house her father's money had bought into, and troubled by the silence between the two of them, had judged on his own that his Grace ought at last to be told what his wife had done. Julian read it standing at his own window. He read that his wife had spent the whole dead winter buying, share by secret share, the very bank that could have thrown his family into the road at Lady Day. He read that she now held the note over his own head in her own hand. And he read that she had never once, not in the orangery, not through the dower wing door, said a word of it to buy his love or his mercy or his thanks. She had saved his house. And she had let him call her a costermonger and banish her in his mind rather than beg him to see it. Julian Devereux sat down on the edge of his bed with the letter in his hand, and he understood, all at once and far too late, what kind of woman he had married and how badly he had failed her, and he wept too, though no one would ever tell that part in the county. Then he washed his face, and he dressed, and he went down to set his house right in front of every soul who had watched him let it fall. The great hall blazed, 400 candles, the old Hartwell silver out, the salt cellar in the middle of the long table where it had sat 150 years, and every place laid. At the foot of the table, below the salt, in the cold seat by the draught, a small white card had been set that read only Mrs. Devereux. Augusta had seen to it that afternoon, smiling, striking out the Her Grace with her own pen in angry ink, exactly as before, because she meant to end where she had begun, with the creature put down in front of the county one last time before the note fell due, and finished her. The guests came in. They took their places, murmuring. Clara came in last, in dark green, quite calm, and she saw her card at the foot of the table, and she read it twice, and she did not turn it over this time. She simply stood behind it, waiting, her hands folded, and she looked down the long blaze of the table at her husband at the head of it, and her face gave nothing. Augusta lifted her glass. She could not help herself. The room was full, the moment was hers, the ruin was 3 days off. "How good," she began, in that carrying voice, "to see us all gathered again, and how right that we should each sit where we belong. We are always grateful, my dear, to the tradesman's, aunt." It was Julian. He had stood up. He did not raise his voice. He never would learn to raise his voice, but he had learned, at last and just in time, to use the quiet one. 30 faces turned to him. He came down the whole length of that long table in the candlelight, past the salt cellar, past the county's finest, and he stopped at the foot of it, where his wife stood behind the struck-out card. And in front of all of them he picked up the card that said Mrs. Devereux with the Her Grace scratched out, and he looked at it, and he tore it in two, and he let the pieces fall. The hall had gone entirely silent. "My wife," said Julian Devereux, Duke of Hartwell, in the quiet voice that carried to the last chair, "does not sit below the salt in this house. My wife sits at my right hand," and he held out his arm to her. Clara looked at him a moment. The whole county held its breath. and then she laid her hand on his sleeve, and he walked her the length of the table, past the staring faces, past his aunt gone the colour of tallow, and he seated her in the great chair at his right hand at the head of the Hartwell table, and he took his own seat beside her. And only then did he look down the table at Augusta and say, mild as milk, "You may go on, aunt. You were saying something about gratitude." Augusta could not go on. Her glass was still half lifted. Her mouth worked. And into that silence, up the table from hand to hand, came the second blow, and this one Clara had arranged herself. She had asked the footman to bring it in at the suite. It was a single folded document, and it went from the servant to the nearest guest with a murmured word, "Pass it up to Lady Augusta if you would," and it travelled up the long table hand over hand, everyone glancing at it, no one daring to open it, until it reached the old woman's place and was set down by her plate on the white cloth. She looked at it. She looked at Clara. And because she was Augusta, and proud, and could not bear a thing she did not understand, she opened it there in front of them all. It was the notice of the board of the Merchants and County Bank of Wexbridge, and it named its newest and greatest director, Her Grace the Duchess of Hartwell. The old woman read it. The room watched her read it. They saw the moment it went in, the moment the name on the paper met the name at the head of the table, and the truth of it came down on her like the roof of her own certainty. Her hand set the champagne glass down on the cloth, untasted, very carefully, as though it had become too heavy to hold, and Clara Devereux, at the head of her husband's table, said the thing she had carried folded in her since the frost, and she said it without heat, without triumph, in the same flat, clean voice her father had used to close a deal. "The bank that holds this house," Clara said, "holds my name on its board now, aunt. The note falls due at Lady Day, as you say. I mean to hold it, gently, so the house takes no harm. You needn't fear for Hartwell. It is in good hands." She let that sit. Then, level and quiet, the whole autumn turned over in one sentence. "Dough sit below the salt. Aunt, I find myself, that trade is quite comfortable there." No one laughed the way they had laughed at Clara in the autumn. It was not that kind of quiet. It was the deeper kind, the kind a room falls into when it watches the world it thought it knew turn over on its axis. And then the chairman of the bank rose. He was a heavy, careful old gentleman, and he had come to that dinner thinking to sit near a duke. He rose in his place, and he turned toward the head of the table, and he bowed, a full bow, from a rich man to his master, and he said, "Your Grace, I had not looked to find you here as more than our hostess. Permit the board to say, before this company, that we count ourselves fortunate in our newest director, and I look forward to sitting under your judgment at Michaelmas." And he sat. And the whole county saw it. They saw the money of the county bow its head to the merchant's daughter they had watched put below the salt 6 months before. Nobility deferring to trade, out loud, in front of them all. At the far end, Sybil Croft's face was a study. She had come as a duchess in waiting. She sat now watching a duchess who owned the bank her family banked at, and something in her cold, pretty certainty curdled and went out. Her mother leaned to her and said, "Not quite low enough. Well, that is quite another matter then, quite another matter altogether. Already recalculating, already retreating." And Sybil said nothing, because there was nothing a dull, well-bred girl could say to a woman who had just quietly bought the ground they all stood on. But the thing that mattered most that night was not said to the room. It was said under it, in all the murmur and the turning and the chairman's bow. Julian, at the head of the table, reached across and took his wife's hand where it lay on the white cloth. He did not make a speech. He had never been able to make a speech. He only held her hand, and he leaned a little toward her, and he said one word, low, meant for her alone. "Stay," that was all. Not command. Not the cold Your Grace, and not even the warm Clara from the orangery. Just, "Stay," a man asking. She had lived in his house half a year, and borne his aunt and saved his name, and never once heard him ask her for anything. And here it was, the one word worth all of it, spoken low under the noise of his own dining hall. "Stay." Clara did not take her hand away. That was her answer, and he knew it, and neither of them said anything more, and the dinner went on around them like a river around two stones. Spring came properly after that, the way it does once it decides. By April the orangery was a white cloud of blossom, and the smell of it reached clear across the walled garden on a warm day, and Hartwell Court, which had smelled of damp and old money and quiet ruin for 20 years, smelled of orange flowers. The note fell due at Lady Day, and Clara did the thing she had planned in the frost, though not quite in the spirit she had planned it. She did not call it and break them. She had the old £62,000 mortgage brought out, and she and Julian sat at the estate desk together, 2 pairs of hands, the ledger open between them, and they tore it up, and they wrote a new one. Not a purchase. A partnership. She forgave the interest that would have bled the house another year. She kept the principal on the books so that Hartwell stood solvent and honest and owed to no stranger. And the rest of the tide, the great weight of the Ainsworth line still working away in the city, she banked in her own name, where it had always been. Because a woman who has learned what happens to those who do not read past the number does not give her seal to anyone. Fenwick's timber theft was long mended. The Poole family at 10 Acre had their roof and their water right, and their 4 children dry. Mrs. Pettifer, the old housekeeper whose eyes were failing, kept her place and her pride. Because Clara went on quietly mending her sums, so no one ever saw a figure go wrong. The tenants were secure. The house was sound. And the merchant's daughter sat at the head of the table now, and no one in the county ever again struck a word off her card. Augusta stayed. That surprised some. Clara might have turned her out. The annuity that kept the old woman in silk was drawn on Clara's own bank now, and a word would have stopped it. But Clara did not say the word. She let her keep it. And when Augusta, stiff and diminished, came to her once in the morning room to say something that was almost not quite an acknowledgement, Clara looked up from her letters and gave her the only line she ever spent on her. "You may keep your seat, Aunt," she said, "and your annuity. I don't grudge it you." A small pause, dry as her father. "I keep the bank. You keep your chair. I think we shall both be quite comfortable." And that was the last of it. Augusta ruled the corridors no more. She sat by the fire and drew her income from the woman she had called trade, and said nothing sharp again in that house, because there was nothing sharp left to say to a duchess who owned the money. Sybil Croft married a baronet within the year, and was heard to say Hartwell had grown very odd. No one minded her. In the evenings that spring, and for a great many springs after, you might have found the Duke and Duchess of Hartwell in the estate office, with the lamp lit and the ledgers open between them. She was still faster than any clerk. He was learning. She showed him the columns, and he learned to read past the number at last, and they went down the accounts of that great old house side by side, 2 pairs of hands on the same page, the orange blossom coming in soft through the open window. Because that is the whole of it, in the end. Not that a merchant's daughter beat a duke's aunt, though she did. Not that she owned the bank, though she did. It is that a house is not saved by where the money came from. It is saved by what the money is used to protect: a roof over the Pooles, an old woman's failing pride, a dead vine brought back to bloom, a marriage that started as a contract and ended as a partnership. Worth is not the number you are paid, it is what you build, with 2 pairs of hands once the paying is done. Clara Ainsworth married a title to save it, and stayed to save the man inside it, and never once begged to be loved. She simply became impossible not to love, one true and quiet thing at a time. If this story reached you, tell me the town you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. And if you believe, as she did, that a life is built with 2 pairs of hands, stay a while. There are more of these to tell.